When we say the idea of India, there is one concept of India where you can think in terms of a country with a multiplicity of identities, I mean people, identity groups, multiplicity of identity groups. You have different religious communities, you have different linguistic communities, castes, and so on, living peacefully, living in harmony. And that is India. India as a coexistence of a multiplicity of different identity groups who coexist peacefully. And that is an idea to be celebrated. There is an alternative idea of India, and that actually says that we visualize an India in which people have transcended their specific identities and have come together to constitute an alternative collectivity of citizens, collectivity of a fraternity of citizens. Now that idea of India is one which of course does not say that identities of other kinds get obliterated, but they get, in fact, there is an overarching identity or the overarching formation of a fraternity of equal citizens that transcends individual identities. I believe that these two, this distinction between is something which afflicts, for instance, the concept of democracy. Whether democracy is to be seen in terms of representation of different identity groups, accommodation of different identity groups, let's say kind of, arrangements whereby they can coexist because you have negotiations between them. That is one notion of democracy. The alternative notion of democracy is the formation of the possibility of the formation of a collectivity of citizens who, as a fraternity of equals, can intervene politically to shape their own lives and to shape their own destinies. I believe the latter is the only authentic concept of democracy, because the former, which believes in, let us say, negotiations and accommodations between different, let's say, religious communities or between different linguistic communities, is to start with tolerant of the pre-existing inequalities in society, and what is more, over a period of time, there's no equilibrium. The equilibrium shifts in favor of the majority, in favor of the majority community, in each of these cases, in favor of the more powerful groups. As a result, if we are actually thinking in terms of democracy, then we have to think in terms of the fact that the people as a collectivity of citizens can actually intervene politically to shape their own destinies. I think this was the concept of democracy which underlay the 1931 Karachi Congress resolution to which Shuklaji referred. This also is the concept that actually underlies, in a sense, the Constitution when it talks about we, the people of India. The people of India constitute, as it were, a collectivity that transcends their individual identities, that, as it were, constitutes the formation of a new collective identity. Now, I believe that not only is there this distinction, not only is it the case that any authentic notion of democracy must mean that the people collectively can constitute a group that can intervene meaningfully to shape, through politics, to shape their own lives and destinies. But if one does not do so, in that case, the danger is that you slide into the other concept of democracy in terms of accommodations, in terms of negotiations and so on, which essentially then ultimately means the continuation of an unequal society, and of course over a period of time the strengthening of the more powerful, the strengthening of the majority, a strengthening of a kind of majoritarian tendency. Now, I think in order to have this authentic notion of democracy, which was, as it were, what underlay in my view, the implicit social contract that was formed in 1931 at the Karachi Congress, on the basis of which, if you like, the independence struggle in the 30s took off in a big way. In order to realize that notion of democracy, certain minimum conditions must be fulfilled. The first condition, of course, is that everybody must have a certain minimum level of living in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of nutrition, in terms of a minimum material standard of life, without which you cannot have the kind of subjectivity, collective subjectivity of the people that is essential for democracy. The second thing is that you must have a degree of egalitarianism. Again, otherwise that subverts the notion of a collective subject that the people can constitute. And the third, which is not often realized, is the fact that if democracy is supposed to mean anything, if it means that people can collectively, politically affect their own lives, in that case politics must matter. For politics to matter, it is important, therefore, that politics must govern economics. Now, fundamentally, in my view, that is not what happens under capitalism. In a capitalist society, which is fundamentally, if you like, a spontaneous economy, capitalism is driven by a whole lot of inner tendencies. Nobody wants a crisis in a capitalist economy, but crises happen. They happen not because anyone wills it to happen, but because it's a spontaneous system. It's a self-driven, self-driven system in which things happen independent of people's will and consciousness. Now, if that is the case, then in such a society, intervention in a political manner through, for instance, the state in the functioning of the economy has inherent limitations. The biggest intellectual challenge to this in the 20th century was posed by John Maynard Keynes, who, as you know, argued that a capitalist economy left to its own devices generates unemployment, people are not going to tolerate it, and as a result it's very important to have an intervention by an agency that, in his liberal conception, was an embodiment of social rationality, namely the state, and as a result, through politics, you would be able to rectify the errors of the system. The collapse of Keynesianism is, in a sense, proof of the fact that the spontaneity of capitalism as an economic system wins over in the long run, because any political intervention in its functioning produces a kind of dysfunction where either you carry political intervention further and further in order to overcome the system itself, or alternatively, if you want to retain the system, then you move back on your political intervention so that the spontaneity of the system asserts itself. Now, this as a phenomenon is of course general, but in today's world, the fact that politics is something whose capacity to make a difference to the functioning of the economy is greatly attenuated arises from the times we live in. The times we live in are characterized, on the one hand, by the existence of nation states. When people elect, they elect a government of India. On the other hand, if you have the country which is part of a flow of global finance, a flow of global capital, the capacity of the nation state to intervene in the movements of globalized capital, once it's open to the process of globalization, is of course minimal. As a result, in order to prevent capital from flowing out in vast magnitudes, you have to make sure that the global investors are happy with your economy, that global capital finds you a hospitable space to which it can then be attracted, where it can dwell. If anything happens through political intervention that goes against the predilections of globalized finance, then of course finance leaves and the state is forced to cut back on its intervention. So today, above all, when we are living in a world of globalization in which the capacity of the people to intervene politically is at best at its at its very best limited to the terrain of a nation state. You actually have, in a very fundamental sense, an attenuation, in a very fundamental sense, a restriction of democracy, because after all you have a restriction of politics. And if that is the case, then necessarily what you find is that the other requirements which I said are essential for realizing the notion of democracy, where people as a collectivity intervene politically to shape their own destinies, all those get subverted, get undermined. The minimum standards of living which are essential for making a fraternity of citizens are in fact increasingly denied. In fact, someone referred to the poverty debate. If anything, you find that in terms of nutrition, there has been, without any doubt, a worsening in the living conditions of larger and larger proportion of this country's population. Likewise, inequalities increased dramatically. All that is required in order to produce a march towards a meaningful democracy. Democracy is not something which is just achieved like that. Even to progress towards a meaningful democracy, all the preconditions of that are being subverted in the current specific kind of economic regime in which we live. As a result, what is happening is that the other notion of democracy comes to the fore. What we have, as a matter of fact, therefore, is a situation where the state, on the one hand, has to kowtow to the caprices of globalized finance, globalized capital, and on the other hand, you have a plethora of identity politics. What is remarkable about identity politics is that, what is, there's no contradiction between these two, because the state kowtowing to the caprices of globalized capital really amounts to the fact that the people who politically are supposed to assert their subject role, in fact, are reduced to the role of objects. But of course, this objecthood is not overcome by identity politics, because identity politics, the essence of it is that as objects, there is competition for a few crumbs that actually fall from the table. So essentially, you have a combination on the one hand of the objecthood of people, a denial in a very fundamental sense of the space for democracy because of the kind of economic regime that we are in particular the economic regime of globalization that has ushered in neoliberal capitalism, and on the other hand, that has given rise to a kind of identity politics where the collectivity of the people, the capacity to intervene itself, is subverted, and the two, in a sense, go in tandem. But a part of the logic of the development of the system is also that it is prone to crisis, and what we are witnessing today is a global crisis and its manifestations in the Indian context as well. The manifestation in the Indian context takes the form, as was referred to earlier, of the fact that we have a combination of a tendency towards stagnation, massive slowing down in the growth rate that was taking place earlier, a combination of that together with inflation, together with a decline in the value of the rupee, all of which impinge very badly on the living conditions of the people, because we have an inflationary crisis. In fact, a condition for this inflationary crisis at all a condition for this inflation at all to be, I don't know how to put it, that suppose it was the case that the people were not being hit by inflation, suppose it was the case that you would have wages being indexed to prices, then prices would hit infinity. The fact that you actually have inflation going on and on and on is predicated on the fact that there are some people who are continuously suffering because of it. If they did not suffer, then there would be no inflation, then prices would explode to infinity. So you have necessarily a squeeze on the living conditions of the people through inflation, through heightened unemployment. Even in the period of high growth, we know that on the one hand, there was a massive process of primitive accumulation of capital in the sense of dispossessing petty producers, peasants, and so on, where it was no longer profitable for them to operate, and quite often they actually were evicted from the lands that they were operating, without at the same time the creation of the decent employment that capitalism traditionally promises to create. And as a result, you had an enormous swelling of informal sector unemployment, part-time unemployment, casual employment, and all the rest of it, all of which entails a swelling of the poverty-stricken population. But what is more now, even the generation of that employment is going to be further hit, and therefore you'll have a further crisis. So a combination of inflation, unemployment is something which is going to affect the people very sharply. And this at the same time, therefore, provides the context in which a change can be thought of. Obviously, the preservation of any democratic institutions required in this context a change in the kind of trajectory of development of the country. Not surprisingly, this is also the context in which a serious effort is being made for a corporate control over the state through the medium of an individual who's been projected in the media as the next prime minister. And that, to my mind, is an effort at a direct corporate control over the state, which is a symptom of fascism. Now, essentially, therefore, at this particular point, the chances of launching a struggle for recapturing, as it were, the trajectory of movement towards democracy are certainly existent and even bright. But we have to be careful that any such attempt must also mean a change in the nature also of the economic regime. If you are, as it were, caught in the vortex of globalized financial movements, then the essence of popular sovereignty, where people can affect their own lives through political intervention, is something which is subverted. If you want to recapture the latter, then you necessarily have to create the space where the state has a degree of autonomy, because of which political intervention by the people can use the state so that a better India can be built. Thank you.